The President, please be seated. The court is now back in session. And I hand over to the prosecution to resume his line of questioning. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon, Your Honours, and good afternoon, Professor Chandler. We were discussing before the break the classifications of the population post-April 1975. And the ways in which you have discussed the treatment of these people. Now, continuing on from that point, what I would like to discuss next is your analysis of the 4-year plan of the regime, which, of course, is discussed or reproduced in the book that Judge Cartwright referred to yesterday, the book you co-edited, entitled Pol Pot Plans the Future. What I would like to look at now is, as I said, your analysis of that plan and some of the conclusions that you draw. And just for everyone's benefit, this is the analysis of this plan is contained in the book Brother Number 1, which is E3/117, and it is also contained in Professor Chandler's other books, including A History of Cambodia, which is the book I wish to look at now. Professor Chandler, if you could go to pages 214 to 216 of the book, and I'll read out the relevant ERNs. The Khmer ERN is 00679175277. The English ERN is 004228842. In Brother Number 1, you indicate that the plan was introduced by Pol Pot in August, but here we move into the contents of the plan, if you like, your views and analysis of the contents. So at those ERNs in A History of Cambodia, you say the following: it called for the collectivization of all Cambodian property and proposed ever-increasing levels of rice production throughout the country with the aim of achieving an average national yield of 3 metric tonnes per hectare, or 1.4 tonne per acre. The pre-revolutionary average, harvested under less stringent conditions and with monetary incentives, had been less than a tonne per hectare, one of the lowest in Southeast Asia. A few lines below that, you state the following: the plan had been hastily written. There was no time to conduct studies to see if its proposals were appropriate to soil and water conditions in particular areas, or if the infrastructure needed for other programs was in place. Instead, the plan called for an quote, all-out storming offensive, end quote, by all the people. And two more brief passages continuing on in the same text. So just further down, quote, no material incentives were offered the Cambodian people except the bizarre promise that everyone would enjoy dessert on a daily basis by 1980, exclamation mark. A little bit further down again, where you talk about the concept of accomplishing this swiftly, I quote, in explaining the plan to high-ranking members of the party, an unnamed spokesman, presumably Pol Pot, stated that the plan could be accomplished swiftly. The DK revolution, after all, was a new experience, an important one for the whole world because we don't perform like others. And this here is quoting the language of the regime. We leap directly to a socialist revolution and swiftly build socialism. We don't need a long period of time for transformation. Could I ask you to expand briefly on your conclusion that there was no time to conduct studies, that no studies were conducted, and that instead the plan called for an all-out storming offensive by the people?
Well, the plan, like many other policies set in place in democratic Cambodia, sprang from foregone conclusions rather than any examination of possibilities or potentialities of the policy taking effect. I mean, just as they, no, neither be. But at the beginning of the introductory paragraph to the plan, was the explanation, which you haven't cited. Pol Pot says, in a kind of typical, I think, rather typical DK fashion, why do we need the plan? Because we need the plan. His answer is we need it because we need it. No question of discussion or anybody said we don't need one, whatever. We need it immediately. Another reason he didn't mention, of course, is we need it because this is what revolutionary regimes do when they come to power. They set in motion plans, usually after a while, not immediately, not within a. This is within. Well, the plan was supposed to come in about a year and a bit after coming to power. It was drawn up much earlier than that. Drawn up from, as I say, wishful thinking and foregone conclusions about the way things had to occur in DK under the leadership of the, under what they call the clairvoyant leadership of the CPK. I think they were imitating, they never cite the models they're copying. As a matter of fact, the 3 tons per hectare I found out, I stumbled across when I was writing the Voices from S21, turned out to have been a policy introduced in one of the model areas of China in the early 1970s to the same point. It was done with mu instead of hectare, but it comes out to the same. So it was a model that came from China. So did the phrase, the Great Leap Forward they used a lot, came from China without saying that it did. But the idea that Cambodia's riches were in agriculture was true, that its potential lay, at least the way they could see it at the time, not being too certain, for example, of the oil deposits, which have only been guaranteed very recently, that agriculture would in the future be the source of income for Cambodia. The plan, in a way, makes a kind of sense. What it doesn't do, of course, as I tried to say before, and it doesn't take consideration for what was actually going on in 75 and 76, just as it doesn't pay attention to the failure of the Great Leap Forward or such other events outside of Cambodia. It's built on hope. It's built on the assumption that the liberated energies of the poor, as it were, taking a lid off the oppressed lives that they allegedly have been leading, would be enough to fuel the engine of the revolution and produce these targets. I think there's lots of things in the plan that can be talked about, such as they were going to get if we have oil, we will find it, stuff like that. But the main thing was to impose a dream, really, a dream onto the Cambodian people of this kind of level of production. It's, of course, complete speculation, which is off base a bit. But had the target been set at 2 tons per hectare, quite a lot more success might have been achieved. 3 was out of reach. Pol Pot didn't think so, but it turned out to be completely out of reach for most of the country.
And briefly, could you, because we're discussing here a speech attributed by you to Pol Pot, could you tell us if you have been able to conclude which body, or whether it was an individual or a group of people, issued the plan?
I'd have to recheck the text of what I said at the time. It certainly wasn't a document originating from Pol Pot personally. It emerged from the party leadership. I think it was a composite draft. There was some writers have suggested that parts of it were written by Khieu Samphan, but I'm not saying that. It was it's collectively written, certainly, collectively approved, coming out of the collective leadership, and it was again, you never get a single signature on any DK documents, but only the leader can explain, and only the leader has had the final word. So it comes out of this collective mentality, collective leadership, which must be centered at some point in the Central Committee, but we don't have that specific information.
Thank you. And as far as you have been able to glean, how was, well, first of all, was that plan communicated to people who would then implement it?
No, as far as we know, it was not. It was never put into effect. The reason why it was not put into effect is the specific reason is not known, but I suggested it's connected with the sort of tidal shunt that took place in the Cambodian Communist Party toward the end of 1976, September, October, in that area, in that period of their rule. It was withdrawn from. It was never widely circulated, and it was withdrawn from execution. Although the slogan 3 tons per hectare continued through the regime, through the end of the regime. Let me just think what I was thinking. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Insofar as the 3 ton per hectare slogan continued to be used, did it have any effect on the implementation of policies and practices throughout the country?
Well, I think certainly it certainly frightened people. It frightened the people who were supposed to carry it out. These would be the cadre, district, and sector and zone leaders in the countryside who had to produce these targets. To what extent they actually produced the targets, we don't know. The information, at least I don't think the information is available. It wasn't available to me when I wrote the book. But there's quite a lot of evidence that in order to get even close to the targets, they cut back on the amounts of rice that was supposed to be set aside for seeds and for feeding the population in order to deliver a sufficient amount up the line. And as I said in one of them somewhere, I just was reviewing it yesterday, there's an irony tied in with the whole idea of Cambodian self-sufficiency and failure to rely on foreign aid. It's ironic that several 100,000 tons of rice were exported to China at this time to pay them for the unacknowledged aid that they were giving. In other words, the Cambodians were trying to show that they were producing surpluses when they weren't to the Chinese as a matter of fraternal solidarity and so on. All over the country, and all kinds of evidence you get, you hear evidence of food supply going down, nutrition going down, starvation coming up, deaths from malnutrition going up, all connected, I think, to the kind of scare qualities of this 3-ton target. It was a target that was just always stressed, and never denied, and it was too much to make, too much for the people to produce.
Now, moving on to one particular region that you looked at, and this is now in brother number 1. And the relevant ERNs in Khmer, 0082 1782. Professor Chandler, if you're looking at the hard copy, it should be page 117 of brother number 1, or ERN in English, 00393 031. Have you been able to find that passage? It should end with... I will read it. Quote, most of the work in the northwest would be done by more than 1 million April 17 people who had been evacuated from Phnom Penh and from the city of Battambang into rural areas in the zone. Over the next 2 years, these men and women were forced to hack rice fields, canals, dams and villages out of malarial forests. Tens of thousands of them died from malnutrition, disease, executions, and overwork. These deaths, when they became known, distressed the authorities in Phnom Penh only to the extent that they indicated that, quote, enemies, end quote, were at work behind the scenes. New people, because they were so numerous and, quote, class enemies, end quote, of the revolution, were expendable. Many survivors recall a chilling aphorism directed mockingly at them by cadre. Quote, keeping you is no gain, losing you is no loss. End of quote. I would, first of all, Professor, if you could tell us what evidence you looked at in arriving at the conclusions of tens of thousands of deaths in this particular region.
One of the main sources for information about the conditions in the Northwest were refugee testimonies after the war. A large number of the refugees who got into Thailand came from that area, and many of them, as new people, were educated to a certain level where they would find themselves in a position to give detailed and articulate descriptions of what had happened. The casualty figures I've taken from a couple of books, which are just estimates. There are no formal estimates of the casualties under DK and in these different zones. One of the points of the Northwest, as well as being filled with new people, was it was not an area that had been under systematic Khmer Rouge control during the Civil War. This meant that there were not as many well-trained or competent or screened, whatever word you want to use, local cadre to handle the population. A situation very different in the Southwest, different in large parts of the East, in the Northeast, and even in some of the areas around Phnom Penh in the center and north of the country. This was a frontier to which new people have been sent, and also cadre often with no connection to this part of the country. It's very important because in a great many parts of the country, the Khmer Rouge leaders of a local area would be from that local area. And this doesn't mean that they'd be especially just or soft, but they knew conditions, they knew people to work with, they could gather. In the Northwest were cadre who had not come from there, who had little experience in administering, and were then, once you've expended, if you like, enough of the new people, the regime decided that these were the enemies, really, not the unproductive new people, but the cadre that had been sent there to run the show were the ones who'd wrecked it. This all comes from the absolute the sense that the Communist Party has monopoly over the truth. In other words, it can never be wrong. Therefore, there's no question of saying from the center, oh, that policy was wrong, therefore we must change the policy. No, the policy was right. So there has to be some other reason for its failure as opposed to its intrinsic shortcomings. And these were exactly the same strategies followed by Stalin. These were blamed on wreckers and various people who just couldn't do the right thing.
And where you discuss the movement of more than 1 million people, April 17 people, from Phnom Penh to that region, have you been able to ascertain whether that was a result of, or rather, I'll put my questions differently. Have you been able to ascertain which decision or decisions led to that particular movement?
Without the precision that might be helpful if I had the sources right in front of me, but the passage suggests that the new people, suggests mistakenly that the new people evacuated to the northwest had been sent there from Phnom Penh. No, these were people evacuated from Phnom Penh to various places and then gathered up at the beginning of 76 and sent up to the northwest by truck and train and sometimes on foot. This is called the second evacuation. It's called that. It's in all in the literature. So very few of the new people, well, I'll correct that. New people from Battambang, which is a reasonably Cambodia's second city, were all evacuated into the northwest. So this situation began to occur, and a refugee I spoke to in 76 who'd fled then in the optimistic period was one of several hundred who jumped off out of the northwest quickly when it was starting to, new people. These formed the basis for the first interviews with refugees. But anyway, most of these people went to provinces near Phnom Penh where they had relatives, because most people in Phnom Penh in those days either had come from these regions anyway or had relatives in them. So they would be in the southwest, the east, the south, no, there is no south, the east and the center. But they were gathered up to go, once this plan is starting to get thought of, they're gathered up and moved into the northwest as a, you can call it a slave labor force or just a cutting edge, any word you want to use. These are the people who had to do the work. There weren't enough people up there to achieve this 3 tons per hectare. Where were the extra people? Well, they were the city people, obviously. And up they went to the northwest. So the phrasing evacuated from Phnom Penh in the paragraph, there's not really, I wrote it, but it's not exactly right.
And just for the avoidance of any doubt, you described that coordinated, or that movement of people from a number of regions in early 1976. Where did that decision emanate from? If there was a decision, please elaborate.
Oh, it emanated right from the party center. It was connected with the whole policy plan that ended up producing this 4-year plan. This was all part of their strategy. It was not nothing of this dimensions was ever ad hoc in Cambodia. It was always right from the top.
Thank you. And lastly, on this passage, you've indicated that you interviewed survivors, and some of this information is based on those interviews. Are you able to expand on this aphorism, keeping you is no gain, losing you is no loss, how that was applied, if it was applied, and what effect, if any, it had in practice?
The effect it had in practice was to scare the people to whom it was directed, and this was the purpose of it. It was quoted so often quite early on in the people starting research on the Khmer Rouge in 80, 81 with survivors and with people living inside the country, still living inside Cambodia after the collapse of the Khmer Rouge. So widespread, this was just almost a slogan for the what do we tell the new people? Tell them this. I mean, there's no evidence of that order, but this came all over the country. People had this slogan. It was in their ears. It meant, or it rang in their ears, you are worthless. But if you want to survive, just work extremely hard, and we'll decide from day to day what happens to you. It's a terrifying slogan, and it was very, very widespread. I heard it myself many times from survivors of the regime.
Thank you. Moving on to the issue of deaths or estimated deaths, numbers of deaths during the 1975 to 1979 period. Obviously, you've studied this for many years, and so there are a number of references, and I will give you two to your own consideration of this number. In the Tragedy of Cambodian History, at English ERN 00422-860, it should be page 233. For this, we appear to also have a Khmer reference. There have been partial. No, I do apologize. This is only available in English. I just want to check and make sure that I have the correct ERNs here. So looking at tragedy, the correct ERNs, I'll just read them out to make sure that we have it correct. 00193-084 in English. And in Khmer, it does appear that we have a Khmer except for this 0082-0993. You state the following, quote, under the regime of democratic Kampuchea, 1 million Cambodians, or 1 in 8, died from warfare, starvation, overwork, misdiagnosed diseases, and executions. That was in the Tragedy of Cambodian History. You revisit the issue in A History of Cambodia, and just for the record, that was D366/7.1.69. You give the following estimate. Although Vietnamese anti-DK propaganda was often heavy-handed and inaccurate, even cautious estimates of DK-related deaths caused by overwork, starvation, mistreated diseases, purges, and executions came close to 2 million Cambodians, or 1 in 5. That second book is an edition from the year 2000, and there is obviously a difference in estimate. Would you care to expand on how you arrived at those figures and whether you still consider the estimate given in A History of Cambodia to be accurate?
Yes, I consider the later estimate to be my later estimate. I mean, this is taking advantage of a lot of interesting demographic work that was done. None of it by me, but I'm also joining. I was given just now this demographic expert report. I was supposed to have that, I suppose. Was I?
No, if you don't mind, don't look at that.
All right, I'm sorry.
So just
didn't see it. But the point is, a consensus developed in the early 2000s about the level of deaths, drawing on these same demographic sources that I had used, their books and articles that I'd used. So I've joined the consensus, not having the skills to calibrate up or calibrate down. In conversations I've had since then, there are people whom I trust but don't want to just quote that now the evidence looks to be that it might be higher. It might be approaching closer to 2 million than 1.5. But I've stuck to 1.5, 1.7 because that's, well, I won't say received wisdom, that's a phrase, but it's what people are agreed on at the moment, and I'd be perfectly happy to change those figures if better information came to hand.
Thank you very much. Just for everyone's benefit, I considered also showing you a demographic expert report, but in the interest of time, we'll move on. I think you've explained your conclusion, and that is sufficient for our purposes, and I thank you. I now wish to move on to...
Mr. President, yes, Defense Counsel for Mr. Nonche, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to make sure that we get the meaning of what just happened, I was not clear on what document Professor Chandler wanted to discuss and whether or not he had looked at the contents. His initial remarks seemed to indicate that he had. He then later said that he did not read it. I don't want to suspect any foul play, but maybe the prosecution can clarify this, because, again, it's about the sources of knowledge of Mr. Chandler that we talk here today as well.
Mr. President, I think it's a fair comment by my learned friend. The document which was in our bundle and which we were considering showing Professor Chandler is the demographic expert report, which is, of course, on the case file. For the record, the document number is D140/1/1, and perhaps to avoid any or to remove any doubt, we can ask the professor whether. Well, let's just take it one step at a time. Did you look at the figures in that report?
I mean, I was given it. I thought I could read. I'd never been given anything I wasn't supposed to read, so I don't feel I've committed any sort of mistake. But on the other hand, I didn't examine it in detail. What I did look at, I must say, without examining everything in detail, was the end to see the conclusion. And the conclusion showed in the footnote, I think this can go on the record because it's a document, a consensus that had developed from a variety of sources in the footnote. It cites several sources, and these would be the ones that I mentioned that I'm in agreement with. Now, if I examined the document officially, I would have had to say, if it was different, I'd have to say what my own conclusion was still. It's not going to be changed by this document. What I saw was they referred to this consensus that I did refer to, so I said, that's fine. Which is 1.5 to 1.7 kind of thing, million. It's an awful figure, but yeah.
And that's really what we're seeking to elicit is your own independent conclusions. There was no mistake on your part, Professor Chandler. It was inadvertently given to you because it was at the back of another document. But we have your own conclusions, and that suffices. As I said, I wish to move on to yet another topic. And it is related in part to some of the questions that you were asked by Judge Cartwright yesterday. It deals with, broadly speaking, the appointments to various bodies during the Democratic Kampuchea regime. And what I would like to begin with is another quote from one of your books. We're going back to Brother Number 1. We have this in Khmer, so if it could be shown on the screen, that would be appreciated. It is E3/17. The Khmer ERN is 00821773-4. The English ERN is 00393021-022. It's really just your treatment of the relationship between the party and other bodies that I'm interested in. And this is what you said. If we could show the Khmer version on the screen, that would be appreciated. Quote, "The party, concealed by the facade of the revolutionary organization, in brackets, the name it had assumed among Cambodians, was still officially hidden behind the National Front, with Sihanouk ostensibly the chief of state. Layers of disguises, revolutionary names, and secret meetings protected South Sa from the judgment of ordinary people. Party members who had been assigned new responsibilities took up their work in secret, disguised by revolutionary names. The complex charade hid the real division of spoils, whereby high-ranking members of the party carved out areas of patronage and control." Firstly, if I can ask you, Professor Chandler, whether you considered internal documents, standing committee minutes and the like, which deal with that period. And I'm discussing here 75, before we get to that decision you discussed yesterday.
Yes. Yes, you can assume that.
Now, what you, perhaps in hindsight, the question was perhaps unnecessary. As we go through these passages, there is additional information. You do look at the October 1975 standing committee minutes, and you go through the minutes and you note certain appointments, and I think this may have been discussed, so I apologise if I'm covering ground that's already been covered. You indicate the Comrade Deputy Secretary Nguyen Chia was responsible for party organisational work and education, and Ying Seri was to handle foreign affairs for the state and the party. Khieu Samphan remained as liaison officer with the National Front, that is, with Sihanouk, and he was also given the task of the accountancy and pricing aspects of commerce, recalling his cabinet post in the 1960s. As far as your research has indicated, again, in part you may have already answered this, but perhaps not entirely, were these roles indeed performed by the accused during the DK period?
Yes, they were. I would alter the wording slightly of that passage now, with hindsight, of course. I think the phrase that I used there, carved out, is a little harsh. I think what they had is they had a group of people who had certain capacities, and I think they looked, in a way, I mean, I don't mean to give them a lot of credit, but it's more understandable than that phrase carved out would suggest, which would suggest just a kind of gangster group. The person with experience in foreign affairs had been Ieng Sary. Nguyen Chia had a lot of experience in educating party cadre. This has come out in his autobiography and other places. Khieu Samphan had this commercial portfolio that he performed very well when he was a very conscientious cabinet member for Sihanouk in the 60s. He had knowledge of that sort of issue. So these people were not picked at random. This was I guess you could say the best and brightest. This is what they had. Ieng Turit had to teach them teaching experience, so she was over in that social affairs there. People got assigned. Sun Sen had been an active combatant. He started life as an anthropologist, but during the Civil War, he'd shown talent as a military leader, so he was given. So I'm just taking back the phrase "carved out" because it's not really fair. It's as if they gave these positions for the disadvantage of more competent people. That's not. It's poorly worded. It's really given the materials, it was the best they could do. So it was a set of choices.
And moving on from that October 1975 document and those decisions, I want to briefly go through the process of adoption and promulgation of the Constitution of Democratic Kampuchea. In other words, the birth of the state itself. As far as your research takes you, Professor, and considering our earlier discussion about the front and the existence of the front as well as a government, were those bodies active as at or post-April 1975? Did they continue to perform any executive role as far as your research indicates?
I would say almost none. It was a continuing facade. I mean, Sihanouk came back to Cambodia as the so-called chief of state and was driven around an empty city and then was told to go on a trip here and there and do various jobs. Khieu Samphan was liaised with him and was played the role that he was supposed to play as being the liaison with Sihanouk. But it's pretty clear by then the game was up. I mean, Sihanouk, I said earlier, very good social and political antennae, and he could see that he was really not the chief of state anymore. It was just but he had no actions that he could take. So I would say the actions that took place by the ruling party between April 65 and 75 and the promulgation of the Constitution in, I think it was January 76, were just done in secret and carried out the way they wanted to do it. It was not without, there were no laws, of course, but without any kind of open discussion of what was going on.
Thank you. So then, looking at the process of the adoption of the Constitution, there are a number of publicly available records on this and some CPK documents. So I'd like to consider only a couple of them. Document E3/273 is a Foreign Broadcast Information Service transcript of a report attributed to Mr. Khieu Samphan on the draft of the Constitution that is dated the 14th of December 1975. Professor Chandler, have you, in your research, come across Foreign Broadcast Information Service transcripts from this period?
Oh, I certainly have. They're one of the major sources of internal knowledge of this country up to 78. And I'm familiar with this particular one also. I remember citing it, I think.
Thank you. Your Honours, if we could display it on the screen, the English ERN is 00657439240. The French ERN is 0025796-97, and the English is 00167-811. What we can do is show the Khmer version on the screen, and we will hand the Professor a hard copy. Professor, if you could look at, in your copy, the versions where the ERNs end with digits 96 and 97. It's that particular passage that I'm interested in. This document reports on a Congress which was held according to the document, at the end of April 1975. And then the events which followed that Congress were as follows. This resolution of the Special National Congress is the basic essence of our Constitution itself. Two lines below that, the Special National Congress set up a constitutional commission in charge of preparing a written draft of the Constitution. The Constitutional Commission of the Special National Congress then held successive meetings to discuss the draft and finally decided on a draft constitution, which was then submitted to thorough examination and consideration by the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers then submitted to the Commission its suggestions for amendments to the draft.
Mr.
President, says the Council. Yes, Council, you may proceed. Thank you, Mr. President. Could the prosecutor first ask the expert whether he has seen the document before? Otherwise, it can be very confusing if we do not know whether the expert has studied this document before or not.
Perhaps it didn't come through in interpretation, but the expert, in fact, indicated that he had looked at this document. If I can continue. So, thank you, Mr. President. The Council of Ministers then submitted to the Commission its suggestions for amendments to the draft constitution so that the draft could be gradually improved. For your information, the SAMDEC Chief of State also agreed to the principles of this new constitution. Currently, the SAMDEC is engaged in a series of visits abroad and thus cannot attend our present Third National Congress. The SAMDEC Prime Minister, present here, also fully approved this constitution. This report, as you can see, Professor Chandler, describes a process by which the constitution was drafted, commented upon by a Council of Ministers, and ultimately submitted for approval. Based on your research on these processes and events, does that reflect an accurate process by which the Constitution came into being?
I'm not at all sure that it does, because I would have to refresh my memory again, but I'm not aware that there was a lot of publicity about this National Congress, which was established in Phnom Penh. He says the phrase Council of Ministers. I'm not sure which ministers there were, where the government hadn't even been established yet. The SAMDEC Prime Minister is Sihanouk's old Prime Minister, Pen Nut, who was there. The whole thing was railroaded through. I have a feeling, I guess it's only a feeling, can't prove it, that a lot of this documentary bit about procedures was for overseas consumption. DK knew that their broadcasts were being monitored and read overseas. It seems to me this makes it sound like a very step-by-step or thing with lots of advice sought from all sorts of parties. And what we've heard all day and yesterday, this is not the CPK way of proceeding. So I have my doubts about this reflecting the reality. But again, they're just doubts. They're not anything firmer than that.
Thank you. Following the adoption of the Constitution, the documents which I will show you report on elections reportedly held on the 20th of March. The next document which deals with this is E3/274, and as I said, it is a report on the elections. It's another FIBIS extract. and we can pass a copy to the Professor if that would be appropriate. Thank you. The relevant ERNs are Khmer 007000118, French ERN, which I understand is an incomplete translation, is 007000112, and English 00167-986. Now, I don't propose to go into great detail in this document, but at those ERNs that I just read out, it states the 20th March elections were successfully carried out, with all of our people aged 18 years and up casting their ballots with enthusiasm. The results from all polling stations throughout the country are as follows. He then proceeds to give some figures, and I'll spare the interpreters going through them, but it concludes that 98% of the eligible voters participated in the election. Again, if we can refer to your research of the period, your interviews with survivors and other sources you looked at, are you aware of evidence of elections being held and participated in by 98% of the population?
Well, that's 90% of the eligible voters, and the new people were not allowed to vote. So this means 98% of the presumably base people, military people. It's inconceivable that this number of people could have voted in an election in Cambodia at this stage of its communications and its stage of its infrastructure. 98% in the most thorough elections in Cambodian history under UNTAC, you got up to, I think, 70%. It's 98%. I mean, so there's something very inaccurate. Of course, you have high party cadre listed as factory workers here as candidates. Another wonderful anomaly is that 520 candidates, 250 people elected, no sense of who the losers were, how the choices were made. Some people remember going to the election. Sihanouk himself voted. Well, I mean, otherwise he'd say that he didn't. There was no election, he didn't vote. So he voted. Some of the areas voted. It was very spotty, but certainly this does not reflect electoral politics were then abandoned. This never returned. I think again this is largely for overseas consumption. It's to show that this is an orderly transition of power from the front organization to the new regime. But the elections themselves, I think, you can't give any real credence to them in my mind.
Thank you. Now I would like to look at the document which you discussed with Judge Cartwright yesterday. This is the decision of the Central Committee of the 30th of March 1976. It's document E3/12. And we have a hard copy, Professor, for you, President, with your permission. Thank you. What we will endeavour to do is, as we go to any new document, we'll provide you a hard copy, and hopefully we'll keep track of what we've provided. Now, what I'm interested in is at English ERN 00182-813. In Khmer, it is at 00003140, and the same passage in French at 00224366. It is a discussion of the establishment of state institutions, and I just wish to read one part of it. If we could show that on the screen in Khmer, thank you. The The passage that I wish to read, Professor, is as follows. It may be difficult for you to follow on the screen in Khmer. The true nature of our state organisation at this time is different from before. Previously, the true nature was a front, capital F, not now. They are the state organisations totally of our party. Must have all state organisations have true representative characteristics with sufficient influence both in the party and in the country and outside the country. This is a political offensive as well. Does that passage reflect your understanding of the practice, or did the practice differ from what is stated in this decision?
No, I think that's absolutely in line with what they were doing. This is a document by the insiders about what they were doing. There's no reason to lie to each other. This is a truth-telling document.
Now, moving on to the Constitution itself, and just looking at a couple of provisions, we don't want to spend too much time on this. Article 5 of the Constitution deals with legislative power, and the first sentence of that article says, legislative power is invested in the representative assembly of the people, workers, peasants, and all other Kampuchean labourers. And it mentions the number of 250 members which you referred to. The document that we looked at earlier, the report attributed to Mr. Khieu Samphan, E3/273, the report on the Constitution, states the following. The Constitution stipulates that this law-making power should be given to the Assembly of People's Representatives, which is elected directly by the people, as indicated in Article 6. In fact, this law-making power is given to the Assembly to establish various political lines for both the internal and external policies of the country. And before I ask you some questions, Professor Chandler, against the backdrop of those provisions and the report, if we could look at a minute of the Standing Committee. This is document E3/232. It is dated the 8th of March 1976. The relevant page in Khmer is ERN 0017118. In English, 0018260. And in French, 003233933. If we could have that document on the screen. Thank you. Now, what I wish to focus on is a comment in this document which states as follows. Quote, "If anyone asks, we must explain, not be wild and disorderly. Do not let it be seen that we want to suppress. At the same time, do not speak playfully about the Assembly in front of the people to let them see that we are deceptive and our Assembly is worthless. In fact, it still remains the task of the party." Considering that provision of the Constitution and then these comments, Professor, do the comments reflect the reality, or was there any implementation of the Constitution as stipulated in relation to the Parliament.
No, I mean, this is a tremendous DK document. I've seen it before. It's don't speak playfully about it. In other words, don't tell the people this whole thing is a facade and a joke, because just keep quiet about it. Although it is a facade and a joke. That's what they're saying. This is not a genuine, but it will please people overseas. It'll keep things, make us look orderly and allow us to proceed in the way we want to proceed. And that makes it, I think, a very typical document from the top. The National Assembly, as far as we know, convened once and under Nguyen Chia's guidance. Now, it's hard to imagine that, some of these members of the Central Committee came trooping in the clothes of their factory uniforms or their rubber plantation gear and sat there and listened to. The Assembly consists of, there's a lot of high-ranking cadre in the National Assembly. It's hard to think that they would have trooped in with everybody else if it met. But the point is, it did meet once. We think there's some evidence that it did. Document it then adjourned. It was never brought back to, never reconvened. So, yeah, I mean, this document says, don't worry about it. If you've heard something about it, just be discreet. Don't say it doesn't exist. Don't say it's useless. Etc.
Thank you. And one final subject on the Constitution is insofar as it relates to the establishment of bodies. You've helpfully referred already now to a session of the Presidium of the State of Democratic Kampuchea. There is a document on the case file which records a conference of the legislature of the People's Representative Assembly. This is document E3/165. Or rather, I'll just take a step back before I show you that document. I will just go back to the decision of the 30th of March, which is E3/12, and look at decisions that are reported there about certain appointments. So this is E3/12. The relevant ERNs in Khmer 00003141, in English 00182813214, and in French 00224366 to 67. This was discussed by Judge Cartwright, or you were asked questions by Judge Cartwright yesterday. What I would like to do is, if we can show that the relevant passage on the screen, and just look at those appointments, or those reported appointments, briefly. If we could have that Khmer document on the screen. I think, Professor, you already have a copy of the decision. Yeah, it's ready, so if the AV unit could assist us. The passage essentially starts with the heading, the actual organisation. As for the Assembly, it indicates the methods, or rather it states, quote, the methods and regime of work as follows. 1, all representatives, in fact, live with their people on into the future. Number 2, the Standing Committee of the People's Representative Assembly of Kampuchea, Chairman Comrade Nguyen, First Deputy Comrade Pim, Second Deputy Comrade Mok. Then below that, on the appointment of the Presidium of State, Chairman Comrade Hem, First Deputy Chairman Pen Nut. On the government, just looking at that section, the government, quote, must be totally an organisation of the party directly of our state. The wish is for it to be strong, must have influence in the party, in the country, outside the country, with friendly countries and with enemies. The government appointments there are Comrade Pol as First Minister, Comrade Van as Deputy Prime Minister for Foreign Affairs, Comrade Vaughan, Deputy Prime Minister for Economics and Finance, and Comrade Kiu, Deputy Prime Minister for National Defence. If we start there with the last body, if you could tell us who those 4 individuals are. Comrade Paul.
Certainly. Just to preface, though, it's interesting, I think it's amusing in a way that the Standing Committee of the General Assembly is also members of the Standing Committee of the CPK, this Tamok and Salpum and Nunchia. So you've almost... Anyway, the second one, first, Paul is Pol Pot, Van is Ieng Sari, Vaughan is Vaughan Vet, and Q is Q Sampon. That's it, those 4.
I just want to, for the avoidance of doubt, on that last one, Comrade Q.
No, Q is Son Sen. I'm sorry, no wrong. Defense. Q is Son Sen. QQ, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I just want to...
No, you're, my mistake.
Avoid you being asked
certainly,
about it
certainly.
In subsequent examination. Now, and Chairman of the Presidium of State indicated as Comrade Hem. Who do you understand that to be?
Yeah.
If you could repeat your answer for the record.
I'm sorry, Q Sampon.
Were there any other senior people that you are aware of, based on your research, in that group that we're looking at, or more broadly, within the CPK hierarchy, who had the same alias, Hem?
Not that I know of. That's a name that he used. I think he admits it in his autobiography and so on. I think this is quite well known.
Thank you. Now, I will now return to that document on the conference of the legislature that I mentioned earlier, E3/165. We have obviously a Khmer version of that document. It is the original version. And if that could be displayed on the screen, the ERN for this passage starts at 000533634. That was the Khmer ERN. The English ERN is 00184-068. And the French ERN 003-01354. That's the beginning of the section. Now, this document is dated or reports a conference held on the 11th to the 13th of April 1976. I don't propose to, again, go through names other than to perhaps just point to the people that we're concerned with primarily. It looks at the Assembly approves the selection and appointment of the Presidium with Comrade Q Sampan as Chairman. It then goes on to, under heading 6, to deal with the selection and appointment of the Government of Democratic Kampuchea. And there again we see Pol Pot, Ieng Sari, Vaughan Vet and Son Sen in the positions that you looked at earlier. And after that there is an appointment of, or rather an assignment of a number of committees answerable to the Deputy Prime Minister for Economics, Vaughan Vet. Professor, what, if any, conclusions can be drawn from the fact that whilst the Assembly report indicates that the Assembly had had detailed discussions and decided on these matters on the 11th to the 13th of April 1976, given that, as we saw on the 30th of March, it appears appointments along very similar lines were made by the standing, or rather the Central Committee. What, if any, conclusions can be drawn from the events as they're reported by the documents?
I would say clearly that the appointments were not made as a result of discussions inside the Assembly. The decisions were made as if this Assembly meeting really did go on for that period of time. The appointments were made, the appointments were ones that were agreed on by the Assembly, having been presented to them by higher-ups. That's the way it worked. It wasn't, they didn't push the proposals up. The proposals came down toward them. That's the significance of your two dates. It's an interesting way of looking at it. 30th, here's what's going to happen, and then they say something else happened. It's not.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. It is now appropriate for us to take a short break. We will break until 3 o'clock. Court officer is now instructed to accommodate the experts and return him to this courtroom at 3 o'clock. The court is adjourned. All rise.